Hello and welcome to our weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm Hazem Sika. Syrian rebels have intensified their assault on Damascus, declaring the city's international airport a fair target. Government and rebel forces are locked in a battle to the south of Damascus, where the airport has been closed to civilian flights on and off for the past 2 weeks. The airport holds logistical value for President Bashar al-Assad, but its loss would also be symbolic, bolstering the rebels' claim that Assad has lost control of Syria. And meanwhile, several Western countries have issued warnings to Assad's government not to use chemical weapons. Those warnings came after a U.S. official said Washington had intelligence that Syria may be preparing to use poison gas. George Sabra, the president of the Syrian National Council, issued his own warning on Syria on Friday.
Given the serious likelihood of this criminal regime using these weapons and the devastating consequences on our people, we warn the world of the catastrophic outcome. We call on the UN Security Council, the world's superpowers and Arab countries to bear full responsibility for the Syrian people, who have been left alone to face death and extermination for more than 20 months.
UN Chief Ban Ki-moon was asked about the threat of chemical weapons in Syria on Friday. Here's what he had to say.
We have no confirmed report on this matter. However, if it is the case, then it will be an outrageous crime in the name of humanity. I urge the international community, and in particular the Security Council, to stand united and act decisively to end that crisis.
Well, joining us now are our three guests. From Ankara, Lale Kemal, a military analyst and the Turkey correspondent for Jane's Defense Weekly. From Washington, D.C., we have Joel Rubin, a former U.S. State Department official. And joining us from London, James Denselow, analyst in Middle East security at King's College London. Good to have you all with us. Let's talk first of all about these warnings over the chemical weapons. James Denselow, let's kick off with you. The Syrian government, as well as its critics in the West, accusing the United States and the United Kingdom of conjuring up this threat of chemical weapons to justify a future military intervention. Any truth to that?
Well, we don't know exactly what kind of intelligence the US have got, whether it's human intelligence from defectors. We had the Foreign Office spokesperson, Jihad Makdisi, high-profile defection this week, or whether they have satellite imagery showing weapons being mixed or moved. I think there's two other elements to this which are particularly interesting. The first is, of course, it provides some political cover to the decision to deploy Patriot missiles to Turkey along with US and German operators. And secondly, the Syrian state, the regime itself, is fighting a civil war. It's shrinking in its sovereignty over the country. Therefore, it may be moving these weapons into zones which are more secure from capture from rebel use, as they have lost air bases and significant military depots. So it could be a combination of these factors. But clearly, the Western Alliance and the British Foreign Secretary said the same thing today, are preparing the ground for a greater connection from Western policymakers to events in Syria.
Yeah, we'll talk about the missiles in Turkey in just a moment, but Joel Rubin, inevitably comparisons have been made between this and the drumbeat to war in Iraq back in at the end of 2002, 2003, the hyped up threat of weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was accused of having, and of course we all know how that ended. Is the comparison with that justified here?
The situation in Syria, as we watch it and as the intelligence assessments appear to come out, are very calibrated and they're very explicit. It's a different situation from what we saw in Iraq. Certainly with Iraq, the questions about what Iraq had in terms of nuclear technology on the ground, those were not in the public eye and in the public domain for such a long period of time, as we've seen with Syria and its chemical weapons arsenal. But also it's very important to realize that with Iraq, while there was an invasion and an action that imploded the state, right now with Syria, there are several scenarios that we're looking at for where this heads. Assad could hold on for a significant amount of time longer. He could disappear and the state could collapse. But what we really need to try to achieve is a managed transition where the state doesn't collapse like what we saw in Iraq, where there actually is a way to ensure that security returns to the country and Assad is moved out, and that these weapons are part of that secured transition. A total regime collapse would be a very dangerous situation for Syria, Syrian people, and for the region.
Lale Kemal, NATO decided this week to send US, German and Dutch batteries of air defense missiles to the Turkish border, putting hundreds of American and European NATO troops close to the frontier with Syria for the first time in this crisis. And we have Russia's ambassador to NATO as well saying this week that this risked dragging the alliance into the conflict. What message do you believe all of this is sending?
Before that, I will briefly make a comment on Iraqi alleged weapons of mass destruction, and after the invasion it is found out that Iraqis didn't have these weapons of mass destruction. But we should remind that nobody believed that Saddam Hussein was going to use chemical weapons in Halepce against his people. So this has taken place, in fact, and it was the anniversary lately, the Halepce massacre of Saddam Hussein, late Saddam Hussein. So though Syrian chemical weapons attack appear to be less likely, still taking the Halepce massacre as an example, we have to be cautious that Syria may even use chemical weapons against its population. And separately, concerning to your question, the message, even the Patriots haven't yet arrived to Turkey. The Chinese reaction, Syrian reaction, Russian reaction, Iranian reaction that the Patriots, deployment of Patriots on Turkish-Syrian border is very provocative and will further undermine stability in the region. In fact, demonstrate, even before these missiles are coming, demonstrate how these nations are concerned, how the Patriots are going to be deterrent against those nations reacting against the deployment of Patriot missiles, most possibly off 50 kilometers of Turkish-Syrian border.
What are the Turkish public saying about this? Are they comfortable with the idea of a foreign military presence inside their borders, albeit one led by NATO, of which Turkey is a member?
I mean, it's honestly speaking, I have difficulty in understanding Turkish public opinion. Okay, I understand their public reaction to even NATO forces to which Turkey is a member. But over the years, Turkish public is so poisoned against an alliance to which Turkey is a member that unfortunately now we come up with Turkish population who even worry about NATO troops, most possibly around 600 NATO troops, to land on Turkish soil to operate the Patriots. So hard to understand Turkish reaction, but this displays, demonstrates the existing Turkish mistrust to even an alliance that Turkey is a member. Because they pursue the foreign troops, NATO troops, as an invasion forces to Turkey in general.
All right.
So hard to understand, but this is a reality.
Let's talk a little bit more now about the military situation on the ground inside Syria. And James Denselow, we mentioned in the introduction there the possibility of rebel forces taking control of Damascus airport. How much of a blow would that be, if that were to happen, how much of a blow would that be for the Syrian government to lose control of the airport in its capital city?
Well, a huge blow both symbolically and logistically in terms of weapons and other things coming in through the airport. We saw the Beirut airport was a similar sort of strategic prize in the civil war there. However, we have to be careful sort of assessing the rebels' ability to sort of fight in a sustainable manner around Damascus. We saw back in July Operation Damascus Volcano and sort of rebel units popping up all over the city. It didn't really last for particularly long. The logistics of it are very difficult. However, it does focus and refocus the regime's attention on securing its own capital, moving troops from elsewhere, and there is continued talk of how long the regime can keep Aleppo, because it's really struggling to defend its long supply lines there, so having to use aerial resupply in these places. So I think it's a hugely important part of the conflict to watch, and I think depending on what's happening next, the Americans look set to recognise the opposition at the Friends of Syria meeting next week in Marrakesh. We could see some more sustainable logistical supply and support to the rebels. They're obviously capturing a lot more surface-to-air missiles. We've heard reports of dozens of Syrian regime aircraft shut down. So the strategic balance in the country is really changing, and I think that events on the ground are moving a lot faster than the political reactions to them. We've seen emergency meetings between the Russians and the Americans, and the Americans, interestingly enough, have also passed a motion in the Senate to look at further military options and scenarios for Syria too. So a lot is happening over the past week.
Joe Rubin, what's your read on the conflict situation, in particular Damascus airport, if the rebels were to take that? A tactical or a symbolic prize, or both?
It would be both, and I'd like to add on to what James said about the Senate action this week. It was significant that in the United States Senate, a resolution was adopted as part of a legislation that we'll be going through shortly to have the Pentagon study a no-fly zone and what that would look like. So there is a coalescing across party lines right now for looking at different options in Syria. No one in the United States is aggressively advocating for American intervention, certainly not on the ground, although there have been voices calling for a no-fly zone. But if the airport does fall, and we see a continuing rapid change of the on-the-ground situation, that may indeed prompt more engagement by the administration. Certainly next week's political conference in Marrakesh, where it is expected that a political legitimacy will be conferred on the exiled umbrella leadership, that will help facilitate this even further. But the United States itself is very careful to engage militarily and is weighing all the options. And that really is where right now the policy stands. But significant shifts on the ground do have an impact in the way Washington views these events.
Lale Kemal, we know that Turkey has provided something in the way of logistical to support to some of these opposition groups in Syria. But now we're hearing that in the coming days they are going to come under some sort of unified military command. What effect do you think that is going to have on the conflict situation inside the country?
Well, I think the unified command will be much better, I guess, effective in perhaps accelerating the Assad's downfall. For example, several weeks ago, lately, Free Syrian Army shot down 3 helicopters in Syria. And the more Syrian military guys defect from the Syrian army, the more we notice that the opposition forces have an access to the Syrian weapons and equipment. So I think a unified stance will be more effective in perhaps accelerating the downfall of Assad, but also perhaps after Assad, if he goes away. Because also the critical question is what is going to happen and how Syria will be managed, controlled, if and when Assad goes. In the meantime, for example, there are other indications that Assad's downfall is getting closer. For example, some say the Damascus airport's control, seizure of the airport by the opposition will be another sign, because Assad will have difficulty to have an access to escape. And also in the last week, European Union has reduced its staff in Syria. So I think all these are evidences that the Assad's downfall is getting closer.
Joe Rubin, one of the reasons often given for the lack of any appetite for outside intervention in Syria at the moment, and for aiding the opposition in Syria is, and I'm sure you've heard this criticism quite a lot now, is that it remains disjointed, contains elements of what are considered to be some very unsavory jihadist groups. Do you see that perception changing at all in the near future, particularly now that they say that they're now going to come under this unified command?
But that's been a key stumbling block, is to ensure that the political transition process is viable. And clearly the State Department has put renewed emphasis on a new umbrella group that can clearly show that it has a plan and it has the ability to influence events inside Syria and potentially, of course, to work in a future Syria in a way that we could partner. So that political stumbling block has been key. As that seems to be taking a positive turn, and next week we'll see how the meeting goes, that will enable a variety of different options to be discussed further. But Americans are very hesitant about committing troops to the Middle East. After a decade of war, Iraq, and currently still in Afghanistan with nearly 70,000 troops, the American people themselves have not been calling for new military engagements. And really that's been the trend for the last 2 years of the Arab Spring and the changes in the revolution sweeping the Arab world, is to play an active role behind the scenes, sometimes in front, a light footprint, and to ensure that the politics are there first, to not get ahead of ourselves with military action. We've learned the hard way through Iraq that putting boots on the ground is not necessarily a panacea, but using all of the tools of American power is really the key.
James Denselow, is this a stalemate that you see continuing for some time now?
Well, I think events this week have happened so quickly that it's hard to predict a stalemate, but the conflict has almost gone on now for 2 years. I think the unity of the opposition and effective military structures of unity too are an ambition, but I think are a long way away from being realised. And I thought it's very interesting actually watching Al Jazeera's coverage today of protests in Aleppo against the opposition forces, against the FSA, and a lot of people from the Nusra Front, supposedly more legitimate in some quarters of the city, there, a group that has this week been designated a terrorist organisation by the Americans, and also the New York Times reporting on confirmed leakage of weapons from the Saudis, the Qataris and the Turks going to groups they don't support, in essence. So it's very difficult to have unity of the opposition. We shouldn't expect them to be unified in the sense that there's been no political oxygen and space in Syria for decades. Why should they be unified? But on the ground in Aleppo, I had a friend who was reporting there recently, you have different groups on different street corners with different uniforms, different sort of ideologies, if you will, and it will be very difficult for them to unify. However, I suggest that the current structure and efforts of the French in particular are showing a greater willingness on the part of the international community to engage. That won't mean US troops, I agree. The estimates of troops needed to secure Syria's chemical weapons ran up as 75,000. That's a huge number. I don't see that happening. Instead, I think you're going to see far more proactive meetings and stuff coming out of the Friends of Syria groups to try and organise the opposition better, to sort of lead from behind more effectively.
Let's talk a little bit more about some of these diplomatic efforts then, Joel Rubin. And I want to talk about Russia specifically. There's been some indication earlier this week that Russia seems to be softening its position on Syria. It has, of course, blocked action against the Assad regime at the UN Security Council several times. But some outsiders are pointing to signs that Russia is perhaps losing patience with Assad. But its stance hasn't changed.
It hasn't changed, and it needs to change. The theory has been that Russia would not back a losing hand, and that Assad is a losing hand, and that he will depart the scene. But it's taken time for that to settle in. Certainly over the past several days, the past week, with the discussions about the use of chemical weapons, that has really shown a more active diplomatic engagement between Russia through Lakhdar Brahimi, with Secretary Clinton in Ireland this past week, beginning to see distancing now, where signals coming from Russia, from the Foreign Ministry, from the Duma leadership imply that they do not want to put all their cards in the Assad basket. So that would be key, because the people around Assad need to understand as well, not just Assad, that they can't use chemical weapons, that there is going to be a new Syria, and that it is not helpful for them to continue to prop up Assad. And that diplomatic engagement, that communication does need to have Russia fully involved, and Russia, it plays a major role in this.
Lale Kemal, how do you see Turkey's role at the moment in terms of applying diplomatic pressure on the Assad regime?
I think Turkey, as you know, has been extremely active in seeking the Assad regime to go, but in this two-year conflict, so Turkey acted very quickly and, like many countries, perceived that Assad will go, but he didn't go. So at the moment, and also Turkey has been actively involved in regime change in Syria by giving support to the opposition and also giving some logistical support to the Free Syrian Army, though not weapons. But I think I should mention here latest visit of Vladimir Putin, Russian president, to Turkey lately during his meeting with Prime Minister Erdogan. We also speculated some changes in Russian backing to Syria, Assad regime, in the sense that Putin has appeared to have been distancing himself from Assad regime. One evidence for this is cited in, by diplomatic circles in Ankara is that you remember on 10 October, Turkey seized some arms or military electronics equipment on a Syrian-bound airplane leaving from Russia. And this time, for example, Russia didn't ask for the return of these weapons, whereas we were expecting Russia to ask for these 10 boxes that Turkey seized. And Russia, the Russian ambassador to Ankara, for example, saw the Turkish foreign ministry officials, and he didn't claim back those arms or military electronics equipment seized on Syrian passenger airplane. So this, according to sources in Ankara, is a sign that Putin is also backing away from Assad regime.
All right, I want to get Joel Rubin's read on this as far as what Turkey's role should be here, and in terms of, as well, of its relationship with Russia, because there's obviously been increasing tension there. What do you think Turkey should be doing right now?
Well, Turkey is doing, in many ways, what it should be doing. It's certainly the Article 5 commitment to provide support to Turkey through NATO. That has been an important move by NATO to support Turkey's request for Patriot batteries and Patriot missiles. The Turkish diplomatic activity as well in the region and with Russia is essential. Really, the regional dynamics in this and the regional players are most critical to ensuring that we can have a managed transition. The Arab League, the United Nations, Turkey, adding Russia, all of these players make a difference. And so Turkey is in many ways the linchpin. Now, the pressure that Turkey is providing from the north with the Patriot batteries now coming in and the continual political pressure, that serves to hem in Assad. That type of signaling that there will be a consistent front against Assad around him and against his actions, that makes a major difference. So really the Turkish role is essential to a day forward.
All right, James Denselow, I'll give you the last word. Are we any closer to a tipping point here?
I think everyone's looking for a tipping point. It will be to history to rejudge at what point the Assad regime's future died, but everyone seems to accept it has a limited lifespan. I think Turkey, as people have said, is a hugely important country vis-a-vis what's going on in Syria. It's hosting some 200,000 refugees. It's spent hundreds of millions of dollars on that. It is the gatekeeper to much of the weapon and logistical supply into the increasing rebel-held areas in the north. If Aleppo does fall to the rebels, that will be could be a Benghazi for Syria. If you think about all this international support coming in, it is also a bridge to the Russians, and that could be quite effective. It'd be interesting to see whether the Russians are ever invited into the Friends of Syria group. That could change dynamics. Brahimi said that if the Security Council is united, that's the only way for a sort of political consensus to be reached and things like transition to be talked about seriously. But as I say, next week in Syria, we could be talking about significantly different things because the situation is changing so fast.
All right. That's got to be the last word. Thanks very much to all three of our guests, Lale Kemal in Ankara, Joel Rubin in Washington, and James Denselow in London. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Syria. A reminder, you can find extensive coverage and reports on the conflict in Syria on our website. That's aljazeera.com, where you can also view this and other programs on Al Jazeera. For now, goodbye.